This is an ABC News special report. The House Impeachment Hearings. Now reporting, George Stephanopoulos.
Taylor is their star witness.
No question about that, George. They have carefully chosen these first two witnesses, and in particular, Bill Taylor, as you point out, the top U.S. diplomat in Ukraine, a West Point grad, a Vietnam War veteran. He has served Republicans and Democrats, and as we all know, he was selected by the Trump administration for this role. He was recruited by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and in closed-door testimony, he has already said that he had a very clear understanding that nearly $400 million in U.S. military aid would be withheld from Ukraine unless Ukraine and the new president there investigated the Bidens and said so publicly. He was also the diplomat who testified that he texted another, Ambassador Sondland, saying it would be crazy for that money to be withheld to help President Trump's political campaign. And one more key note today, George, that's going to come up are these channels of diplomacy. Bill Taylor talked at length about this, how there was a regular channel of diplomacy that he was a part of, and that there was also this irregular channel that he witnessed as well. And that irregular channel, he said, led directly to the president's personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, George.
For months and months. Okay, David, thanks very much. David Muir, as I said, this was not something we expected coming into the hearing today.
You know, really not at all, George. In fact, it goes straight to the heart of this question, which was also asked of Bill Taylor. Did he believe that Ambassador Gordon Sondland had a direct line to President Trump? And you heard Bill Taylor here today say, yes, in fact, I believe that's true. And when talking about that staff member, this was a conversation that Bill Taylor was talking about today that we had not heard about before. It happened, according to Taylor, the day after the phone call between President Trump and the president of Ukraine, and that it was a staff member of Bill Taylor's who could overhear Ambassador Sondland talking with President Trump, that he could hear President Trump through the phone. This is Taylor's contention, that the staff member could hear the president ask about investigations. Bill Taylor was then pressed here today, what does investigations mean to you? And he repeated what he had said before, that investigations meant Biden and 2016, and that Sondland said to the president on the phone, the staff member could hear this, that the Ukrainians are ready to move forward with those investigations. So, as you can imagine, George, a lot of speculation at this hour about who that staff member might have been and whether or not, as you point out, we'll be hearing from that staff member in testimony in the days going forward.
Yeah, new deposition. David Muir, now this is going to be the Republicans' turn to question. Devin Nunes is the chief, the ranking Republican on the House Intelligence Committee right now. He also has a staff investigator, Steve Castor, who he could delegate some of the questioning to.
And likely one of the central themes, George, that we'll hear in this questioning, particularly of the top U.S. diplomat there in Ukraine, Bill Taylor, is how many times did you talk directly with President Trump about this? How many times did the president tell you what his intentions were when it came to Ukraine? And of course, he'll then have to say that he was not listening in on that key phone call between President Trump and President Zelensky, and that even in these text exchanges, none of these text exchanges obviously included President Trump. But one thing that Bill Taylor did make clear, and in those moments where the questioning had him actually reread the text messages that he had sent. One key is the text where he said, I think it's crazy to hold security assistance for a political campaign. This was in closed-door testimony as well. And he said Gordon Sondland then said the president was clear, no quid pro quo, and Sondland explaining that the president is a businessman, that this is common. And even Bill Taylor said that didn't make sense either, that Ukraine does not owe the U.S. anything. This is in our own national interest, given what's happening on the border with Russia, George.
Witnesses. Anchor David Muir there at the Capitol. One thing that is so clear at the end of this 5.5, 6 hours, this first impeachment hearing, that partisan divide is as wide as ever.
Yeah, civil, as you said, George, but it was politically divisive and politically charged all day here. And, George, you and I began this morning by talking about Ambassador Bill Taylor, the top U.S. diplomat in Ukraine, being the star witness. And it was clear in this afternoon portion that Republicans were zeroing in on some of Bill Taylor's most damning testimony, both behind closed doors and right here today. They pressed him on his critique of this irregular channel of diplomacy, making the point that it's out of the ordinary, but pressing him, is it really outlandish? He paused and would not answer that question. Representative Jim Jordan pressing him on his 3 meetings with President Zelensky of Ukraine, saying, did it ever come up in those meetings? Was there a linkage of the money to these investigations? A quid pro quo? Was it apparent in those meetings? And Ambassador Taylor acknowledged that the money never actually came up in those conversations. And so he pressed him, well, then how did you have a clear idea that this nearly $400 million in military aid was being held? And he again took it back to Ambassador Sondland, saying it came directly from him, that he had said if Zelensky did not clear things up, we would be at a stalemate, and that this included the White House meeting and, of course, the military aid. And the third and major point that Republicans kept going back to, you mentioned it just a moment ago, were you on the phone call? Did you listen in on the president? And furthermore, have you ever had a meeting with President Trump or with the acting chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney? That is a point they'll continue to make going forward, saying that this was hearsay. These were conversations that you were part of and that you heard, but you were never connected to the direct principles in this. You saw the one Democrat who joked, well, then bring President Trump before the committee and let's ask him some questions. That obviously is not going to happen. And in the end, George, the central premise of the Democrats, the money in the end was delivered, they say, only days after the investigations began here up on the Hill and after that whistleblower's report became public.
David Muir, thanks, Justin. David Muir, that leads to, one of the X factors here. As these hearings go on, we don't know what other new information is going to be revealed.
That is the big question. We now know the staff are part of this list, and it also intensifies the scrutiny on Ambassador Sondland going forward, too. We know he's here next Wednesday. He'll have to answer to what it is he's already testified. We know the timeline of that new information today from Ambassador Taylor, that it was one of his staffers who overheard the president talking with Ambassador Sondland on the telephone. They said the president was loud enough that he could hear the voice through the phone. That was one day after the phone call between President Trump and President Zelensky. And yet previous testimony from Ambassador Sondland did not address that particular phone call, that particular day, while Sondland, it's believed, was in Kiev. So he'll be pressed on that come next week. So, yes, new witnesses, perhaps, that we'll suddenly be talking about in the days ahead, but certainly new questions, too, for people who have already testified before, particularly Sondland next week, especially given the testimony we heard today from Ambassador Taylor, which nobody was expecting that new information from the staff.
Right. Okay, David, thanks very much. And David Muir, perhaps the enduring image from today is going to be an emotional one, that her demeanor, the demeanor of the ambassador as she was told about those attacks from the president.
From the president, and then when they went back to them just moments ago, you could see it on her face again. And when she was asked about the toll this has taken on her family, that was the one area where she said, I don't want to go there. I'm a private person, but you could see it in her face, George. And one of the resounding questions that we heard over and over again was, does the president have the power to remove an ambassador? She said yes. Are you still employed by the State Department? Yes. Are you a fellow at Georgetown now? Yes. She was asked, is this the right policy? And she even said yes to that. But she repeatedly went back to this notion, and she said it a number of different ways, why the smear campaign for months leading to my dismissal. You heard Chairman Schiff try to make the case. The reason you are here and the reason for that smear campaign is the president mentioned you and you alone. You were the only U.S. ambassador brought up in that call. And one other point, Congressman Holmes asked her, if you were still in that role, would you have investigated CrowdStrike? No. Would you have supported a 3-month delay in that aid? No. Would you have recommended to find out about Biden's son? No. And he said that's why you are not an ambassador, and that's why you're sitting here in for us today.
Okay, thank you. Let's bring in our legal team. David Muir will be hearing first today from Jennifer Williams.
We will. And George, one of the main differences, and Mary alluded to this earlier, is that 3 out of the 4 witnesses today were actually on that phone call, listening in while the president of this country was talking to the president of Ukraine, the new president there. And it's important to note that Jennifer Williams, top Russia advisor to Vice President Pence, there you see her right there, and she's already testified that Trump's insistence that Ukraine carry out politically sensitive investigations struck me as unusual and inappropriate, more political in nature than other phone calls with foreign leaders. And she also pointed out there were specific references to the president's personal political agenda. As we know, George, the president has already targeted her as a never-Trumper.
She was, and David Muir, struck again by both Jennifer Williams and especially Colonel Vindman in his opening statement, emphasizing their service, emphasizing their years of service. Colonel Vindman emphasizing patriotism with that direct communication with his dad in the testimony.
Speaking directly to his dad, the decision for that family to come when he was just a young boy, saying, you would be proud of me being here today because we're in a country where speaking out is allowed in a democracy. But to go back to the 2 points that you just made there, George, about what the lieutenant colonel, and we all saw there today how important his rank is to him, that you use it correctly from that committee. Not only did he point out that there was no mention of corruption, you heard John Carl say that the War Room is saying the president didn't follow his talking points. That's why he's upset. But it also flies in the face of the fact that Republicans have said for some time now the president was simply trying to root out corruption, and it wasn't on either call. And the second thing he went into in great detail, George, was that July 10th meeting, Ambassador Sondland there, as we all know, when that abruptly ended because of Mr. Bolton, actually, National Security Advisor, stopped the meeting short. There was that second meeting where Ambassador Sondland, he said directly to him, possibly in questioning, he said in front of some Ukrainians that were still there, that this was inappropriate, this request, and that it has nothing to do with national security, which puts even a greater focus on Sondland come tomorrow.
Not necessarily, including David Muir, one witness's name we heard a lot during this first hearing, the supervisor to Colonel Vindman, Tim Morrison.
Tim Morrison, it raises the stakes for him this afternoon. This is a Republican witness that we're talking about this afternoon. He has neglected to say so far whether or not he thinks anything illegal or improper happened, but his biggest fear, and we heard it this morning, was that this would be leaked, that the transcript of the phone call would somehow get out there over time. But this growing tension now between the Lieutenant Colonel Vindman and Tim Morrison at the NSC will be something that's probed this afternoon. You also have Ambassador Volker, former special envoy to Ukraine. On the one hand, he said in his testimony already that he saw no evidence of a quid pro quo. On the other hand, though, he's part of the three amigos. Rick Perry, obviously Gordon Sondland, the EU ambassador, who are part of this back channel, and he'll be pressed about these text messages where he was helping to prep for this public statement from the new president of Ukraine in a back and forth saying, no, you've got to double down on these two key points, these two investigations.
Yeah, and David Muir, like Gordon Sondland tomorrow, that concession was clearly the biggest news in his opening statement when he said that he should have seen the connection, and had he done that, he would have raised objections. We're also going to be watching for revisions tomorrow from Ambassador Sondland.
Yeah, no question about that, George. And you know, he went even further today, Ambassador Volker, when in talking about Burisma and Biden, he actually called them conspiracy theories. He said that had he known that raising the 2016 elections or Vice President Biden is what the president wanted, these I consider to be conspiracy theories circulated by the Ukrainians. I would not think this is in our national security strategy with Ukraine. And I think tomorrow, a lot of pressure on Gordon Sondland to try to explain these text messages that went back and forth between both him and Ambassador Volker about getting the Ukrainians to say exactly what it was that President Trump wanted, and that text message from Volker that said two key things are missing from this statement that was being produced, and now we know what those two things were, Burisma and 2016.
And Chris,
but George, to your point, he's a career diplomat who tried to thread the needle in front of the American people today, and that's why Gordon Sondland will be fascinating tomorrow. He's relatively new to the game. He was a mega donor for the Trump campaign who got put into this role, handpicked by President Trump. He's not had the experience that Ambassador Volker has had in his career to come before the American people tomorrow. How well will he be able to thread the needle?
Well, and he's got David Muir. I'm struck by how Democrats it's not only Democrats who think he's going to be a star witness today, Republicans as well.
There is no question about it. The tentacles that reach Ambassador Sondland were pretty apparent yesterday, George, over and over again. And I was struck by how many times, and going back through the testimony, Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, what he said, Ambassador Bolton cut the meeting short when Ambassador Sondland started to speak about the requirement that Ukraine deliver specific investigations in order to secure that meeting with President Trump. And it wasn't just Vindman, the Republican witnesses as well. This was Tim Morrison, formerly with the NSC. He was asked, what did Ambassador Sondland tell you that he told the Ukrainians? Morrison, that the Ukrainians would have to have the Prosecutor General make a statement with respect to the investigations as a condition of having the aid lifted. He was pressed again. What did you say to the senior advisor to Zelensky? That the Ukrainians would have to have the Prosecutor General make that statement in public as a condition.
Ambassador David Muir, I want to bring you in on this. One of the things I was struck by, it was pretty clear that Ambassador Sondland decided he had some questions about his earlier testimony, that he wasn't going to go down for this, that he wasn't going to face any kind of legal jeopardy. But what was most striking is sort of how remarkably relaxed and casual he was, even laughing and smiling as he was laying out these bombshell accusations.
Oh, there's no question about it. And in fact, in that opening statement, he said this is a very unfair process, and not because of how political the process is, but instead because the State Department had refused to allow him to bring the emails, any kind of records, phone records that might help him trigger his own memory. He's been reacting to other people's contemporaneous notes rather than his own, and he blames that on the State Department refusing to allow him to come. One of the things, though, and you've talked about this, George, by the end of this testimony, it became very clear that while he said he didn't get that direct direction, if you will, from President Trump on military aid, that it was abundantly clear to everyone that this was conditioned not only on that official White House visit, but on the $400 million, the nearly $400 million in U.S. military aid, U.S. taxpayer money. Abundantly clear to everyone that there was a link with military aid and an announcement of investigations, and we were discussing the chicken and the egg issue of should the Ukrainians get out on that ledge, make the statement President Trump wants them to make, but still risk not getting the aid in the end.
And one thing, David Muir, that Ambassador Sondland did not back away from under questioning from either side is the fact that he was not doing this alone in any way. Mulvaney was involved, Pompeo was involved, Secretary Perry was involved, everybody was in on it.
And he said this from the very beginning today, George, in his opening statement. He said that he engaged with the Secretary of State a number of times, saying, please share this with S, which we all know as Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. And he continued to answer this afternoon, saying it was his belief that everyone knew in the end, by the time you got to early September, what the deliverables meant. You know, Mr. Goldman went back at him after this effort to say, did the president ever directly tell you? And he said no to Stephen Castor, the Republican attorney. Goldman going back to him about the deliverables, and that's where he said, I believe that those deliverables were investigations into both Burisma and saying so publicly in order to get the military aid in that White House meeting. One other thing, though, that the Democrats have pushed here, too, is this notion, and they did this yesterday with Ambassador Volker, is how on earth did they not know, in the Democrats' words, in so many words, that Burisma did not mean Biden. And in the questioning for today, he said Ambassador Volker yesterday testified to a similar epiphany was the word that was used today, for lack of a better word, that in hindsight, had you known then what we know now about Burisma, would you have objected? Is that your belief? And Sondland said today, that is my belief.
Yeah, we actually, exactly right. And Sondland, David Muir built on that today with that exchange with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, where he won clearance to set up that meeting between the president and President Zelensky, a pull-aside where they could finally clear this thing up, clear the logjam.
Absolutely. And he said by clearing the logjam, he knew that everyone within this circle, which is the point he continued to make this morning, was fully aware of what that logjam meant. It meant going public with the investigations both into Burisma and the 2016 election, Burisma obviously meaning the Bidens. One of the things, though, on the point that you made with Terry earlier about Rudy Giuliani perhaps being this last line of defense for the president, is you could almost see the Republicans in this second round of questioning this afternoon make that turn. If they think they have a hole, that opening with Ambassador Sondland acknowledging that the president never directly said to him, and if they think that the president's defense on the lawn there at the White House about saying no quid pro quo, that perhaps now it all rests on Rudy Giuliani. And you heard Steve Castor, obviously the lawyer for the Republicans there, asking, you testified Mr. Giuliani's request for a quid pro quo for the White House meeting indicated that you believe that was that he was advancing President Trump's interests, correct? And he said, my contact with Giuliani began late in the process after August 1st. But then he presses, but you testified that Mr. Giuliani was expressing the desires of the president, correct? That's our understanding, yes, was Sondland's answer. And then he said, well, how did you know that? Who told you? He did have an answer to that. He said, when the president says, talk to my personal attorney, talk to Rudy, that's what we assume he meant. And going back to the opening statement, George, he said, Mr. Giuliani was expressing the desires of the president of the United States, and we knew that these investigations were important to the president. So breaking down that barrier about whether or not this was from Rudy Giuliani or whether or not Rudy Giuliani did represent the interests of the president.
And one of the things they try to do is...
Just to underscore this point about how everybody was in the loop, that's the case he's trying to make today, and that this wasn't an irregular channel if you have all of these major players involved. I went back through the opening statements just to try to find how often he talked about the others that he was keeping informed. He said, we kept the leadership at the State Department and the NSC informed in our activities. That included communications with Secretary of State Pompeo. We kept the NSC apprised of our efforts, he went on to say, including specifically our efforts to secure this public statement from the Ukrainians. He went on to say everyone was in the loop. It was no secret. Everyone was informed via email. Again, everyone was in the loop, he said again later. State Department leadership expressed their total support for our efforts. And then again, he says, with the express support of Secretary Pompeo, I move forward.
Yeah, George, and David Muir, the Ambassador Sondland's second main point in his testimony today's opening statement, particularly besides acting at the direction of the president, there was a quid pro quo, is that he was not working alone. He was not a rogue player. As he put it, everyone was in the loop.
Yeah, a central point of what he said today, especially in the opening statement, that he wasn't rogue, that he wasn't part of this irregular channel. And he basically basically said that several others were in the loop on this. He said that terminology, in the loop, over and over again. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, the acting White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney, even Vice President Pence saying he had a conversation with him in Warsaw, and that even if the Vice President didn't respond, he nodded his head, I believe was his testimony. But when it comes to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and he also talked about this, that he wanted documentation of the calls from the State Department, that they wouldn't turn that over. He did bring an email from August 22nd in which he talks to the Secretary of State saying that Ukraine seems to be ready to move forward on the public aspects of these issues important to the president. And when pressed on what those issues were, Sondland said today the investigations into both Burisma and into the 2016 election. And so that second central point that you bring up, George, I wasn't a rogue player. Others knew, and now others have questions to answer, including Secretary of State Mike Pompeo.
And David Muir here in the studio is this morning. The second witness, David Holmes. We heard a lot about him yesterday.
We certainly did, and David Holmes is going to be fascinating today because he was the one who works at the embassy there in Ukraine, obviously in Kiev, who says he overheard that phone call between Ambassador Sondland and President Trump. Said he could hear President Trump through the phone. It was an unsecure line. It was Ambassador Sondland's actual cell phone, and he says he could hear the president asking him, are they going to move forward with the investigation or investigations? And Sondland said that that meant looking into Burisma and into the 2016 election, and Sondland replying he's going to do it. He loves your, and we won't use that word on morning television here, but saying that he uses colorful language with President Trump. And there you see Fiona Hill.
Fiona, yeah, the witnesses are at the table right now. I believe both Chairman Schiff. David Muir, one of the striking things about David Holmes' testimony especially is the forensic level of detail he laid out in that long opening statement.
He seemed to know that the Republicans, when they get a chance to question him, will ask him how he was able to remember in such detail that phone call. But we pulled the transcript, the fast transcript of what he said today, because as you say, George, the description was so vivid. He was asked to describe the restaurant. He said glass doors that open onto a terrace, the first tables. He said he actually thought there were two tables put together. He talked about the tablecloth, the runner down the middle of the table. All of these were meant to sort of reinforce the fact that he remembered in vivid detail this conversation. He actually mimicked holding the phone away from his ear when President Trump was speaking so loudly to Ambassador Sondland, and reiterated what he'd already testified, which was that President Trump, this was the day after the infamous phone call with President Zelensky, asked, is he going to move forward with the investigation? Sondland answering, yes, he is, in colorful language, obviously, that we're all well aware of now. But this is something that David Holmes knows will come his way in questioning this afternoon. How would you be able to remember this? He went one step further. He said, listen, in his long career, he has never sat across from someone having a conversation with the President of the United States on an unsecure phone in an open-air restaurant in the middle of Ukraine on the Russian border.
Yeah, that was